morning, everyone. Welcome to our fifth plenary talk by Dr. Catalina Vizcarra, who will discuss natural resources and public finance in 19th century Peru. Dr. Vizcarra is an economic historian whose research focuses on Latin American economic development and the role of natural resources and institutions, the role that natural resources and institutions have played in fostering or blocking economic development. She's an associate professor of economics at the University of Vermont. She has published extensively in the leading economic history journals on resource endowments and public finance in Latin America in the 18th and 19th century. Dr. Vizcarra, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Great. Hi with everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you. I'm very excited to get the chance or to have the chance to talk about Peru in the 19th century. I think I'm ready to get started here, if I may. The basic title of my presentation is Natural Resources and Public Finances in 19th century Peru. And of course, the reason why natural resources is in there is because we cannot understand Peru in the 19th century without thinking about the role of guano and nitrates. And so my conversation here with you today is going to focus mostly on guano, a little bit of, I'm going to talk a little bit about nitrates as well, and we'll see about their effects on the Peruvian trajectory. So I thought I would start with giving you sort of an overview of the Peruvian trajectory in the 19th century. And the first thing I wanted to highlight is that, Peru in the 19th century, when we think about its trajectory, economic trajectory, what we think of, the first thing that comes to mind is that the 19th century was really a lost century, right? GDP per capita by the end of the century was really at the same level as at the start, right? And so that's the first thing I wanted to mention. Another point that is very important to highlight, to stress, is that Peru really is a poster child of a failed state in the period, right? By the end of the century, very little was left of the state apparatus that we built early on during the Guano era. So here I have a graph that shows the evolution of the Peruvian GDP per capita from 1600 to the 2000s. This graph is really, it's great. It is from Bruno Seminario's book, very famous, very important book, which was published in 2015. The title is El desarrollo de la economía peruana en la era moderna. Highly recommended. This is a fantastic book where he really puts together the whole, this is kind of a, that's a hard thing to do, as you can imagine, but he managed to put together a nice series on Peruvian GDP for this long period of time. And what we see here is, what I want to highlight here is the following, right? So you see that here's the 19th, we have here the 1800s, right? The 19th century. And you see how the wars of independence, right, were disastrous, right, for the country. We go down to GDP per capita goes down to levels that we basically had not seen, not even in colonial times. So we are in a very bad shape at the start of the century. And by the end of it, we're kind of back where we started, right? The War of the Pacific, of course, being the main culprit there. So the whole stretch, right, starting from the 1820s, a bit earlier than that, actually, up to the 1880s, up to the 1900s, actually, up to the start of the 1900s, was really, as you can see, was not very, very good. So anyway, this is kind of the basic, the basic picture. And so, of course, what I'm going to try to do here with you today is to discuss a little bit about, because of course, in 45 minutes or an hour, I can't do a lot. What I can do is, I'm going to try to highlight the key points that should be discussed about the Peruvian trajectory, right? The key issues that mattered. And as I try to do so, I'll try to give you a sense of what I believe was where the main reasons why we had such a tough ride. Anyway, I thought that before I even get into that, it would be good for me to give you a sense of, I want to place the Peruvian situation or the Peruvian experience within the context of the Latin American region. So you get, I want you guys to understand, I want you all to understand that the Peruvian experience was definitely not unique, right? Latin America had as you all know, based on, I'm sure that you have discussed some of this earlier in the course, state capacity, state formation in Latin America, particularly state capacity building, was extremely hard, right? And so very few countries, if any, can be thought of as successful in this respect, right? In the 19th century. So I wanted to give you a bit of a background with respect to the basic findings in the literature, so we can have that as a background as we discuss the Peruvian experience in more detail, right? So anyway, so as we know, the literature highlights, right, this virtuous cycle of war and fiscal capacity, right? Which was the dynamic, right, that was experienced in Western Europe, but was not experienced in Latin America, right? And so most of the literature that is available today stresses the following point. Domestic resources, really, in the end, is the key. If you finance those threats, if you finance your response to those threats, if you finance those wars, let's say, with domestic resources, right, you are way more likely to have better fiscal capacity, better state capacity overall today than if you were financing those threats or your response to those threats with other means, right? Particularly in the case of Latin America, what has been highlighted by the literature is how external financing has been, to a great extent, sort of the culprit, right? So in other words, the literature basically stresses that, in a sense, Latin America was trying to build its states, or these states were trying to build fiscal capacity at the wrong time. And it was the wrong time because we have cheaper external resources, cheaper external financing than what used to be the case in the early modern period, right? And access to it to some extent. And that in itself produces the wrong incentives, right? In other words, we don't have, or Latin American countries didn't have strong incentives to build fiscal capacity, precisely because they had access to this external financing. And so, you can see that, of course, in the work of Centeno, but also in the recent work of World. Very nice work on external financing and its role in building, in state building, right? So anyway, just a few more points about this. As I said, Centeno, is, I don't know if I said this, but Centeno is really the classic work on this for the region, right? And he finds that, yes, Latin America was very unsuccessful in the 19th century to build any state capacity. Most of these countries failed dramatically at that. And he sees that there were, in his eyes, in his view, there were three basic constraints, right? On the one hand, the issue that I just mentioned, he highlights for sure in his work, right? The issue of having wars at the wrong time or building our states at the wrong time simply because the availability of external resources was an option, right? I mean, external resources were an option, and so so that was definitely not auspicious, right, in a sense. But aside from that, of course, he gets into the political economy aspects of state building. He discusses how, there are no alliances to be seen, right, between the states, right, the Latin American states and social actors that could really support such an enterprise, that could really support state building, right? And he also emphasizes how, unfortunately, we had this weak institutional development before the threats hit us. And by the threats here, we're referring to the major wars that the Latin American countries were experiencing in the 19th century, right? Civil wars, international wars, you name it. So anyway, so that's kind of Centeno. I do want to finish this brief, background, mentioning the work of Mazzucca. This is very recent work. This is really excellent work, the most ambitious I've seen on this to date. And what he does in his work is he emphasizes the timing and the environment as these other works did as well. So the timing of state building matters, but he goes beyond Centeno's work in the analysis of the role of international trade, right? And so he's going to discuss how international trade had a major role to play in all of this, in this dynamic, if you wish. So he talks about global capitalism and Pax Britannica producing trade machines as opposed to war machines, right? And he argues that the resulting dynamic of these trade machines, if you wish, was not conducive to state building. There's a number of reasons for this, but if we were to want to summarize one of the basic points that he makes here, we would say that the issue is that it was not in the best interest of the economic elite, which were for the most export-oriented, to build the state capacity, right? I mean, customs was great, right, in many respects, and not paying direct taxes was very nice, and so they were not incentivized to produce any serious work, if you wish, on state capacity. So in Mazzucca's view, Latin America succeeded at state formation, right? The 19th century is a century of major basic state formation in the whole region, and that was okay, right? I mean, that went fine. We were able to some extent, to some degree, after a few wars, we were able to control our territories to a good extent, if you wish. We were able to set our boundaries and this and that, but we, for the most of these countries, with maybe one exception or two, failed dramatically, badly at building state capacity. So all of this is to say that Peru's trajectory is not that exceptional. This failed state picture is not that exceptional in the region. But it was certainly, for sure, one of the most dramatic ones, right? And you know, the one thing I wanted perhaps to mention before I move on into the specifics of how things worked out or played out in Peru at the time is that you know, Peru didn't have just one of the characteristics that the literature associates with failed states. It had them all, right? So the availability of relatively cheap and accessible external funds, of course, Peru had plenty of that. Colonialism is another characteristic that the literature associates with failed states or states that have issues with state capacity. Ethnic divisions, we had that, plenty of that. Rugged terrain, of course we did. And natural resource windfall, big deal, right? And so if we look at all of these factors, we clearly can tell that we shared many of them with our neighbors, right? Most of our neighbors had issues with ethnic divisions, not all of them, but many of them. Rugged terrain, of course, Andean countries, rugged terrain is a big deal. We all suffered colonialism. But the one thing that perhaps is to some extent a bit unique about the Peruvian case is the dimension, right? The importance in terms of the economic importance, right, of the resource windfall, right, of the guano windfall. All of these countries, or many of them, had, of course, export economies that in some cases were very vibrant and so on, but none of them, right, compared to the guano windfall, which is what we're going to be focusing on for much of the rest of our conversation here. So let me get into that. But before I even start talking about guano, let me just say a couple of things about, you know, I want to give you a few estalized facts, right? So if we were to want to have the basic picture of the Peruvian trajectory in the 19th century, we could say that, you know, it might work to divide the period in sort of three different phases. We have, of course, the caudillo period right after independence, which was dominated by military strongmen. Civil wars, of course, were predominant, omnipresent. This was really a period of chaos. You know, Paul Gutenberg has a fabulous work on the caudillo period. I highly recommend it. The title of his book is From Silver to Guano. He discusses a number of critical issues pertaining to the caudillo period and how chaotic it was in so many dimensions. Anyway, so that's the caudillo period. And then, of course, we enter in the 40s. At some point in the 40s, we enter the very famous guano era, where we start exporting this very valuable fertilizer to first to Europe, then to other places in the world economy. That, of course, was an era to a great extent of abundance. We'll see that in a few minutes. And then the whole story ends in the 70s with, you know, a fiscal crisis. Peru defaults on its very large foreign debt, as we'll see then, as we'll see in a few minutes. And we start a totally new period after the War of the Pacific, which is generally referred to in the literature as the aristocratic republic, right? The post-war recovery after the War of the Pacific is dominated by an export-oriented domestic elite. And of course, we won't cover much of that in this conversation, in this talk today, but it's a very, also a very emblematic period in Peruvian history, right? This is when the Peruvian economy took off and started what some people might refer to as modern economic growth. So anyway, so that's kind of the big picture. And let me start to discuss the guano era. Of course, I don't have time to talk about all the things I might want to talk about, but let me give you some of the key, let me just share with you some of the key information you want to know to understand how important guano was for Peru and how guano was linked to the rest of the economy. Also, we want to understand how guano allowed Peru to borrow from abroad in large quantities and so on. So anyway, the guano era was, mostly, the guano era was mostly, we think of it as going from the 1840s to the 1870s, early 1870s, mid 1870s, perhaps. Now, guano, of course, is was an extremely valuable natural fertilizer found on the Peruvian coast. It was a state monopoly. As I said, extremely valuable abroad. And Peru contracted with foreign merchants, consignees, for its commercialization. And so Peru is contracting with important foreign merchants, particularly in the early period. It contracts with the House of Gibbs. And Gibbs is going to be in charge of commercializing the guano resource abroad. Is the one consignee that dominates much of the period until 1862 or so. So anyway, that's that. And one other point I wanted to make is that the guano windfall allowed for the Peruvian state formation, actually. Before guano, as I just said a few minutes ago, we have chaos, literally. It's only with guano that the Peruvian state starts really being able to control its territory, right? And this consolidation really takes place with under the guide of Ramon Castilla, right? Ramon Castilla is the caudillo, right, that was in charge of the country during the most critical phases of the guano era. And so a few additional things to talk about here of importance are the following, right? So the Peruvian state in the guano era, as I said, this is when the Peruvian state is forming. Really, is really taking some, it's really starting to look as a real functioning, to some extent, functioning state. So what happens is that guano allows for major changes in public goods provision. So law and order for practically, I don't think I'm pushing it, for practically the first time in our Republican history, we see some degree of law and order, right? Some degree, I'm not saying with this that we achieved a great result here, but we start seeing some improvements, right, in this respect. So we have the expansion of the bureaucracy, of the military, way better control of the territory. We have the first budgets, right? The first presupuestos, the first fiscal budgets were put together precisely under Castilla. We have the expansion of the administration of justice. It reaches for the first time several regions that were not even provided with this very basic public good. We have our brand new civil code, commercial code, and so on, right? We have our first railroad that goes from Lima and Callao. This was extremely important because Callao was our main port, right? And so the connection between Lima and Callao through a railroad was very significant. We also have our first regular service of mail and telegraph. So you can imagine all of these changes were pretty important and relevant for the Peruvian state, for the Peruvian economy, right? The reduction in transaction costs are, of course, should be highlighted here, right? So anyway, that's that, right? But the other side of the equation, right? The fiscal capacity, right? Is what was sort of lacking, right? And so on the one hand, Guano allows Peru to provide a number of public goods that simply were not even present before we had the guano resource. But the way we finance those public goods was basically through the guano resource, right? And so basically what I'm trying to say here is that in terms of fiscal capacity, we made no progress, right? So we continued relying on extraordinary sources of revenues, right? And this, so this is nothing new, right? That's what we were doing all along. During the Caudillo period, we were always relying on forced loans, loans at extremely high interest rates from different merchants, and so on. And the same can be said of the Guano period, except that now, right, the resources are steadier, right, way more abundant, and we're receiving them, or we're actually facing way lower interest rates for any loans that for all the loans actually that we're getting during the period, right? As you can imagine, foreign debt in the form that we were able to achieve it in the period was better than the loans we were getting early on from the agiotistas and from this extraordinary other sources, right? So anyway, in terms of income, of resources, we have Guano as the largest source of government income. We have fresh new loans after that settlement in 1949. And so, again, what I'm trying to say here is that we are relying on extraordinary sources of revenues, right, of income. And in terms of ordinary revenues, we actually are still dominated by customs. Customs are still there and still providing some decent income. But the second most important source of ordinary revenues we had at the time, before Guano, which was the Indian tribute, was abolished in 1854, if I'm not mistaken. And so during the Guano era, we ended up with ordinary revenues that were shrunk, right? We eliminated the second source of income, the Indian tribute. And as I said, we were relying mostly on those other extraordinary sources. So that's that. Now, before I move on, I wanted to make or to just make one quick point about political institutions. So we're saying here that yes, the state is providing public goods, some public goods that we didn't used to have. There's some sort of state formation going, some control of the territory, all of this. But in terms of the most fundamental issues like political institutions, not much had changed, right? We did have, during the Guano era, new constitutions, the Constitution of 1856 and the Constitution of 1860. One very liberal, the second one more conservative. But all in all, I mean, the basic point here is that that I want to make here is that the basic structure, the basic nature of our political institutions do not change, right? And we shouldn't have expected them to change, right? Going from what Acemoglu and Robinson, as you all know, call extractive institutions, right? Those that are biased towards the elite, those that protect the property rights only for a small subset of the population, and so on and so forth. Going from that to inclusive institutions, right? To institutions that are allowing for broad participation of the population, that are really protective of most citizens' rights and so on. That is a process, right? And that clearly didn't change in the least in the period, right? And so we see some changes in terms of state capacity, right? Or to be more precise, in terms of the provision of public goods, but in terms of the fundamental structure, right, of the polity, in terms of political institutions, not much has changed. Not much changed at the time. Now, I wanted to show you just very briefly and very quickly this table where you can see kind of a reflection of the fact that we don't have a measure. We didn't make major progress or any progress in terms of political institutions, right? We can see here that during the Guano era, we still have a very unstable polity. Of course, less so than in the Caudillo period. We have some degree of stability, right? Relatively speaking, right? Chaos is a lot worse, which is what we had earlier. But still here during the Guano era, we still have a lot of coups and upheavals and civil war and international wars, and right. So I just wanted you all to get the sense, or a sense that, yeah, in terms of political instability, Peru is a bit better off, but not where we would have liked it to be. That's that. And so anyway, just to wrap up this discussion about state capacity during the Guano era, the basic takeaway that I think we should leave this discussion with is the following, right? We have a better provision of public goods, some provision of public goods. We have some degree of law and order that we didn't used to have before, expansion of the military and so on. In terms of fiscal capacity, we didn't make much progress, right? We eliminated some direct taxes that used to be relatively important. The Indian tribute being the one the one tax that is, that is, being the one tax that is the most important, right? That was the most important of those eliminated at the time. We are relying now on extraordinary sources of income. And perhaps the one thing I wanted to mention that I haven't mentioned yet, but it is interesting to note, I think, is that in the mature Guano age, that is basically the mid-60s or so, what you see is that some key political players, Pardo being one of them, who was the Minister of Finance in the mid-60s. He is the one visionary politician at the time that is trying to move the country away from this dependence on extraordinary sources of revenues towards a more sensible, right, fiscal structure. And, what he tries to do, right, as Minister of Finance is he tries to revamp the tax system so that the state could really start, right, financing itself without such dependence on one. And he's trying at this point to pass new direct taxes. He's trying to, really, increase the taxes that the elite potentially would pay, and so on. And the interesting lesson of his of this attempt is that all of his attempts, in the end, or most of it, really fails. And in fact, the government, of Prado, right? Pardo was the Minister of Finance of Prado, General Prado, basically the government was basically ousted as a result of this attempt. So in the end, all of this is to say, Pardo's attempt failed dramatically, right? The domestic elite was not interested, right, in moving away from the status quo at the time. So anyway, bottom line, the state was built on shaky foundations, right? We have ill-defined political institutions and a very weak tax system, right? And that is that. So let me now talk a little bit about, so now after giving you this big picture about state capacity, public goods, and what is it that we kind of did in this respect in the one era, let me just start talking a bit here about, the fiscal finances proper. And so I have a few tables and graphs to show you. So one of revenues as a proportion of total revenues in the period, right, were of course really high, right? We, for a good portion of the period, what we have is a situation where one of revenues are well beyond 50%, 60%. They reach up to even above 80% for some years. So this should give you a sense of the dimension of the one windfall, right? I mean, much, most of government revenues were really based on one. Now, one, as I think I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if I did, but anyway, one was used as a key player in a sense in terms of trying to access foreign resources, right? So the Peruvian government wants to access fresh loans in the 1840s for a number of reasons. Yes, we have the guano windfall. We're starting to export guano abroad. We're starting to feel a little bit more relaxed about getting loans from those agiotistas, or getting loans through other means, or forced loans, or that kind of dynamic, right? We're getting a little bit away of that, but we need to remember that the government is still extremely fragile. Much of our resources at the time are mortgaged already for, to pay for former loans. And so in the 1840s, the government still is really desperate to get, more sources of income, right? And so the Peruvian government is very interested in accessing fresh loans. And it realizes that now it has the opportunity to do so if it were to settle its debt and use, of course, guano to support the settlement and possibly to support, new loans. And so for the Peruvian government to really be able to access foreign capital, it had to do basically two things, right? And this is, of course, the way the literature has kind of visualized, thought of the potential for accessing foreign capital, right? You want to show at the time, right? You want to show a couple of things. You want to show that that you can pay. If you were to get a loan, you can pay it back. And you also need to show that you're willing to pay it, right? It's not just a matter of having the resources to pay the loan back, but you also want to make sure that those potential creditors believe that you're willing to pay it back. Otherwise, they would not lend you a penny, right? And so, yes, the Peruvian government was actually able to produce proof of ability to pay and willingness to pay, thanks to guano. And so, thanks to guano resources, right? And so, in terms of the ability to pay, what the Peruvian government did was it had a number of surveys of the Guano Islands, a number of them, not just one, and very often this was done with foreigners included, right? It wasn't just Peruvians trying to show off that yes, we had a lot of guano. It was really seriously thought out, surveys that included experts from abroad, where that ended up producing this interesting result, right? I mean, of course, the interesting thing when you look at those surveys is that some of them are really optimistic, right? Those were discredited soon enough, but the early ones, one or two of them, were just claiming that there was so much guano in Peru that we had enough guano to get a good flow of income until the year 2100 and some, right? But that of course was discredited right away. For the most, though, many of these surveys ended up discussing how we had a lot of it and how it was going to last for several decades, right? And so that was good enough, of course, from the perspective of the ability to pay, right? Yes, we have a lot of guano, it's of great quality, this is a monopoly, demand is strong, and this government is going to continue having this flow of income for a few decades, right? Guano income at the time, right, for most of the period really was between 2 and 3 million pounds per year. So anyway, that was a lot of money. We can do this, right? Now, in terms of willingness to pay, we have, of course, to show, the Peruvian government had to show that it not only had the ability to pay the guano, but it also had the willingness to pay. And the way the Peruvian government crafted this, the way it showed that, yes, we are willing to pay, we are going to pay, is through this very famous guano debt contracts, right? So we have the consignees in the early period, that's Gibbs, right? And that these very prominent British merchants, right, that are not only commercializing guano abroad, but they're also they also become the state's financial agents, right? And so the consignees are, are responsible. And this is stated on the contracts, right? They're responsible for withholding a good portion of the guano revenues for debt repayment, right? And so, again, the guano debt contracts are really meant to assure, definitely, right, foreigners, potential bondholders, that Peru is going to pay. This British merchant that is commercializing guano abroad, right, in Great Britain, is going to be withholding some of those revenues which he receives abroad, right, to pay for the debt. We Peruvians are never going to see that money. That's going to stay in Great Britain to pay the foreign debt. So, in the end, I mean, the point perhaps that we want to highlight in the end here is that any violation, right, by the Peruvian government of the guano debt contracts would produce very serious negative effects that the Peruvian government would not want to face, right? If it were to violate the contracts signed with the consignees, right, for sure, you would see an interruption of the flow of guano revenues, which, as I just said earlier, that was in some years, 70–80% of government revenues. The government couldn't survive without it, right? So no interest in interrupting that flow of guano revenues, right? And on top of that, of course, any violation of the guano debt contracts, or default, if you wish, if the country would have, if Peru would have decided to, hey, how about we don't repay this year, right? How about we don't honor the debt for a few months, for a year, for good, whatever, right? If they would have decided to default, a credit boycott would have ensued, which was always the way in which, the financial markets at the time worked, right? If you were in default, you couldn't access fresh loans. So yes, the guano debt contracts were very, very solid. They were well crafted to produce this credibility. And as a result of that, this credibility on the part of the Peruvian government that it was going to honor this debt, the potential debt, and that was instrumental really for what happens next, which is the Peruvian government ends up being the largest borrower in the region by a long shot, right? In the period, up to the 1870s, right? After that, of course, we have, Argentina, and we have a different story. But during the guano era, nobody compared to Peru in terms of its ability to produce, not even Brazil, right? In terms of its ability to receive and access foreign credit. Here, I have a quote from a British bondholder. This I found in the Times from 1857. But I think that this is a fabulous quote because it really, in one single, paragraph quote, this bondholder of the loan of the 50s, right? One of the loans that Peru got in the 1850s. He's expressing how the British bondholders viewed the credibility of the Peruvian government, right? And so what he says is the following. I want to read some of this to you. He says, with respect to the suicidal picture of the internal state of Peru, and the amount of their obligations, it is not of the slightest importance to the English bondholders. Did their security rest upon no other foundation than the internal resources of Peru and the honesty of her government, I do not believe there is a single holder of the stock who would value it at 10%. But the security of the guano is unquestionable. And from its local situation, right, is beyond the reach of any government in Peru to control. And so the quantity of guano is far beyond the highest estimate formerly made, right? So, and he continues saying the experience has extended, and its utility as a manure is more and more confirmed. So anyway, bottom line here is that this bondholder is expressing a view of the time, which is there's a lot of guano. It's being, the revenues that it produces are being produced in Great Britain, right? And that in itself, right, this fact is giving a great credibility to the Peruvian government, right? Those guano resources are being produced abroad. The Peruvian government cannot really interfere with that. We feel like this is going to work, right? And it did, right? So here I have a couple of graphs to show you. Here's a graph of in the period, right, from 1830 to 1875. And what you see here is how precisely at the time of the settlement, which happened in 1849, right, the price of the Peruvian bonds start to go up dramatically, and after that, I'll tell you what happens here. There's a period where things are not looking great, but then they continue looking very good, relatively speaking, right? Relative to where they used to be, and definitely relative to the consols, which is what we have here. The blue line up here is the return, the price of the British consols. And so if we were to go to discuss the yield spreads versus the console, perhaps this is nicer. You can see things better here. What you can see here is that the yield spread, right, versus the console, so basically the risk premium of the Peruvian bonds, you can see here how they go down dramatically at the time of settlement. And what I like about this graph is that it compares Peruvian yields, Peruvian yield spreads, right, with those of Brazil and Chile. And what's interesting here is that you see that the yield spread of the Peruvian bonds are, for some of the time, you can see that happening in the early 50s, in some of the, some of that also happens in the 60s. You can see that the yield spreads of the Peruvian bonds are even below that of Brazil, that of the bonds of Brazil and Chile. And that is amazing, right? Because as you probably have seen before, Brazil and Chile were the most stable countries in the region at the time, and the ones that were in better standing with the foreign capitalists at the time. So by a long shot, actually. And so for Peru to be compared to look so good against those two countries is really is really something to highlight, right? Now, I let me just say a couple of things about what happens. I mentioned to you earlier that after this, after settlement, the yield spread of Peruvian bonds, went way down, right? Risk premium is way lower than it used to be, around 2% or so. And then there's a couple of instances where it goes back up a little bit, nowhere near what they used to be, of course, but a little bit up, right? Here, for example, in the mid-60s. In those two instances, what's happening is that there are issues with the Guano Islands. In this context, in the mid-50s, the issue was that the early surveys that were saying guano is here to stay forever were kind of discredited, and we got revised surveys that were saying, well, it's going to last just a few decades, not forever, right? And aside from that, this is precisely a period where Peru was getting a lot of new loans. It got 4 new loans in a very short span of time, increasing its debt dramatically. And so those additional new loans, increased the debt substantially. And so at the same time, you have that situation and the issue of surveys are not that positive. So that created some anxiety, right, on the part of the bondholders, which in the end actually was dealt with by increasing the amortization of the debt. And so anyway, that was an instance that was, had some, got investors nervous, but things went back on track shortly after. Now in the 60s, what you see happen here, mid-60s, is that we have, Spain invades or takes over the Guano Islands, right? There's a war with Spain at the time. The Guano Islands are in jeopardy. And so that makes, of course, investors very nervous. And you see the result of that on being reflected on that yield spread, right? And by the end, of course, in the 70s, that's when things go south, as we'll discuss in a few minutes, right? So anyway, during the height of the guano boom, things are looking for the most great in terms of accessing foreign capital, and Peru, as I said earlier, ends up being the largest borrower by a long shot, right, in the region. So here we have a table that shows Peru compared to other Latin American countries, and you see the staggering numbers, right, for Peru. So you see foreign debt in millions of pounds for Peru is really up to 37 million pounds by around 1873. That compares very nicely, right, with Brazil and Chile. Brazil, the second largest borrower, had about half, right, the foreign debt that Peru had at the time. So anyway, I see that time is flying, so let me just move a bit faster so that we can finish so that I can finish the presentation sort of on time. So if we were to want to have a sort of an idea of how much of government income came from guano throughout the period, right? For the whole period from, say, 1845 to the mid-70s, you would see that guano on loans, right, made almost, a bit beyond 70%, right? So guano is 53%, loans 18%. And then you have customs, which was the one source of revenues that ordinary revenues that we had that was reliable, sort of. And then salitre, nitrates, which become increasingly important in the late 60s, early 70s. And other sources are relatively minimal, right? So it's all about guano on loans, a little bit of customs, and that's it. And in terms of government expenditures, I also wanted to have a table here that would give you a sense of what's happening with that income, right? Foreign debt and domestic debt is absorbing near 40%, right? And then the military is receiving about 19% of those government expenditures. And, the state apparatus, right? The administration of the state, administration of justice, treasury, all of that is about 34%. Railroads, that's a big part of the story, really, in the last. So let me just continue here. All right, so let me just go to my next slide. Okay, so here to finalize this discussion about Peruvian finances, we can see we can see that, you know, before the guano age, here's I'm trying to give you a sense of the fiscal deficits, right? During the height of the guano boom, no fiscal deficits, right? We are getting enough income from guano and some from loans, right? That are good enough to finance.
Sorry,
yeah.
Catalina, we lost the slides, so you're no longer sharing the slides.
Oh, okay. Let me just, so you can hear my voice, but not see my, okay, let me just try to
That's
correct that. I don't, wait, let me just see what I can do.
Also, could you just wrap up? Yes, we will just have a few minutes.
Oh, okay. So that's going to be hard. Okay, let me just see what I can do. 1 second. Let me just, so right now you still don't see my slides, right?
No, we don't.
Okay, 1 second.
Okay, we see them now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so let me just go very quickly over the rest. I just said that I was just saying that deficits are not an issue during the guano age. They become an issue starting in the 1870s. So the end of the guano boom. I'm going to go very fast over this, perhaps too fast, but that's all I can do. Let me just try to do this in the most effective way possible. So the foreign debt ballooned in the early 1870s. We have a new contract with Dreyfus. He is promising to send Peru monthly revenues for the guano he is commercializing in Europe. But the issue here is that in these contracts, as in all guano contracts, debt service has precedence over any other claims. And so as a result of the fact that the sovereign debt goes up dramatically in 1870 and 1872, because that's when the Peruvian government got two important loans to build very fabulous railroads, right? So as a result of that, Dreyfus has to halt payments to the Peruvian government. And so Peru is not receiving any guano revenues from Dreyfus, from Dreyfus starting in 1872. So a fiscal reform is needed. So the government goes for higher tariffs, and it goes also for the nationalization of the nitrate industry. The nitrate industry was starting to be very relevant in terms of revenues for Bolivia, Chile, and Peru at the time, and so the government decides that this is a long story, but let me just make the main point here. The government decides to nationalize the nitrate industry, and that is going to be an interesting development that might have not helped with what comes next, which is the fact that not only Peru has to, in the end, default on its debt, because the fiscal was in the end insufficient, right? But we end up facing the famous War of the Pacific, which was precisely about the nitrates, the salitreras, and who was going to benefit from them. Chile, of course, as you all know, won the war against Peru and Bolivia. In the aftermath of the war, we signed the Treaty of Ancon. We lose all our nitrate deposits. We lose our guano deposits as well. And we face economic depression, financial chaos, and civil war. The aftermath of the War of the Pacific is dismal. It took us decades to recover. And in the end, of course, we have the Grace contract in 1890, which is actually ending the, basically settling our foreign debt debacle, right? Our foreign debt is erased, and in exchange for railroads and other assets. This is a long story. I don't have the time to address that, but with the Grace contract, we are erasing the foreign debt. And of course, after the War of the Pacific, we have to revamp the fiscal system. We are basically reconstructing, right, the state in a sense. We have nothing after the war. So now we have to revamp the fiscal system. We have to do that through indirect taxes, new taxes on consumption. Anyway, this is a long story, but the one thing that is very interesting about this period is that tax collection is partially privatized. And this is so interesting, right? Because it really shows that level of it really shows how little state capacity we had or had left after the war. Tax collection was partially privatized, right? And this private corporation was collecting a large portion of them. Don't have time to address that. Let me just go to my final thoughts. And I just wanted to very quickly tell you a few things about how the one windfall wasn't as bad as it sounds. Not that I was able to present all the facts I wanted earlier, but let me just say a couple of things about how the one windfall wasn't as bad as we might have thought, right? First of all, I want to highlight that the one revenue allowed for the actual formation of the Peruvian state, right? Without the one revenues, it would have taken us perhaps a lot longer, right, to get there. Now, Guano is not anymore, the Guano economy is not anymore seen as an enclave or as a rent-oriented economy as the previous literature suggested, right? Today, we have a more nuanced view where what we see is that Guano financed a good number of important productive activities, right? And that is seen in the work of Quiroz and Segarra, right? Investments in agriculture, in banking, and so on. In terms of living standards, you see some recent works showing, relatively recent works, showing that the urban workers were definitely better off initially with the Guano boom. By the end of the boom, though, the Dutch disease basically strikes and inflation reduces their living standards. Now, on the other hand, we do see important increases in the indigenous population, in the size of the indigenous population, which reflects way better living conditions, right? And that is definitely related to the fact that the Indian tribute was abolished, right? Anyway, there is a number of points that Contreras, Gruber, and Maceo make on the improvements of the standards of living of the indigenous population and of people of mixed races. So finally, overall, the rate of growth of economic growth in Peru between 1820 and 1870, right, is really in the end, I wanted to note, higher than for most Latin American countries, right? If you look at this table, you can see how, Peru is down here. It compares. By 1870, it compares so well with respect to many other Latin American countries. I cannot elaborate too much on this table because, again, we have no time. But later, you might be able to review it and see how much better off Peru is relative to other areas in the period, right? In this period, 1820 to 1870. Peruvian GDP per capita, I think it grew from 1840 to 1870 by about, I think it increased by 100% or so, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, Bruno Seminario has very nice numbers on that. So anyway, in my view, the War of the Pacific was the real breaking point. The income gap, of course, between Chile and Peru, for example, appears precisely after this conjuncture, right? So if you look at Peru and Chile, say in 1870, their GDP per capita here are very close, right? Relatively close, actually very close. By 1913, though, Chile is twice as much. I mean, it's way better off, right? Than Peru, right? Chile really did benefit from the War of the Pacific, right? Absolutely, and Peru clearly suffered from it. So I'm going to skip the counterfactual here. So to conclude, well, let me just say a couple of things here. Just 1 second. If Peru would have not lost the war, we have a paper with Cicotte and with Rich Cicotte and Kirsten Wansnyder that shows that if Peru wouldn't have lost the War of the Pacific, Peru would have earned a lot of money from the nitrates resource, right? We estimate that for a long period, and we find that Peru really was badly affected by losing its nitrate deposits. Anyway, to conclude, the Peruvian trajectory, I want to say overall, is not a reflection of the curse of natural resources. Although some negative effects related to the revenue windfall were felt, right? I'm not saying there was no effects. I'm just saying it's not, I mean, it's not enough to think of the Peruvian trajectory, this negative evolution, right, as a product of this curse, right, of natural resources. That's not what explains this trajectory, I don't think, right? Peru's dismal trajectory has really deeper roots, right? And the bottom line here, I think, is that the proper counterfactual to the one windfall, or to the availability of foreign finance, if you wish, right, is not a sensible development of the tax system, which is the presupposition of a good portion of the literature, right? It's not like if we did not have the one windfall or this easy access to foreign finance, we would have built this fabulous fiscal system, right? The most recent research on the topic, and I'm thinking of Mazuka here, suggests that most likely what would have happened is that we would have been even deeper in the hands of the agiotistas, maybe forced loans and chaos, right? Anyway, arguably, I would say without Guano, the formation of the Peruvian state would have taken an even more, perhaps longer, treacherous path. Anyway, sorry I think I extended my time for too long, but anyway, I think I'm gonna close here. Can you hear me? No.
Fernando, I think that you're good.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, don't worry. We have a couple of questions. We don't have a lot of time, but nonetheless, I think it is important. So the first one is, did Peru intend to create a monopoly in the market of salitre that could provide the fiscal resources that Guano was no longer capable of providing? And was that the intention that eventually led to direct confrontation with Chile?
Yeah, I mean, for Peru to create a monopoly, that would have been very hard to do, right? Because we have Bolivia and Chile as part of the story. So it's not like with the Guano story where Peru really was the sole owner for the most, right, of all of this. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but the possibility of Peru monopolizing this was not that, was not really there. That being said, this was definitely related with the war, right? The Peruvian attempt to to monopolize its section, right? It's part of the industry. Well, to some extent, yes, right? That made a difference. Now, of course, we want to remember that it's Chile that declared war on Peru. I mean, this is a long story, right? We have a treaty between Peru and Bolivia, right, of mutual protection. They were fearing Chilean aggression, right? And so as a result of that treaty, Peru was basically drawn into the war. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I understand we don't have a lot of time anyway, but that's...
Yeah. Okay, second question is related to what labor was used to extract guano? Was it indigenous slave labor, foreign labor, or internal?
It was mostly foreign labor. It was Chinese coolies. There were like indigenous people from even the Easter Island. So Las Islas de Pascua, right? So it was mostly foreign labor, right?
And the related question is why, if basically you can assess that Peru was kind of a poor economy, why would need to actually import foreign migration to do that labor? Why not use the local?
I mean, how do you use the local? You force them, you grab them and force them to come down to the Chincha Islands. It was just, there was just no labor supply, right? Of unskilled labor, yeah.
Well, okay, thank you very much, Professor Catalina. It was pretty good. So we will be uploading this lecture in the coming late today. And thank you very much, everyone.